Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for your time this morning. It's quite appropriate, I think, following Pier Paolo with his presentation and just getting a little bit more into cultural heritage that he touched on. I think it's something that we really need to be looking at in this conference and looking at the role the cultural heritage plays in disaster risk management. And I wanted to talk about that this morning a little bit, and particularly with regards to looking at prevention over recovery. As we've heard over the last couple of days, and we'll hear about today and tomorrow more, is just looking at disasters and what's been happening. And as you can see, over the last century or so, we've gone from roughly 10 natural disasters a year into the 1950s, roughly 35 natural disasters a year, and then increasing by a whole order of magnitude into 2012, 2013. We're somewhere in the 300 to 400 natural hazard events per year. Just roughly other numbers of significance, looking at lives lost, roughly 70,000 people per year, and that's averages over the last 10 or 12 years. A quarter billion people are impacted by disasters, and property costs approaching $200 billion on a yearly basis just due to disasters. Within all of that, we have cultural heritage, and it's obviously difficult to try to put numbers to this, particularly in terms of the physical property and physical damage, and in terms of just having a focus on that in particular. But we are losing heritage, whether on a broader scale through numbers of events or just kind of one-off events for particular buildings or sites. We are losing our cultural heritage over time. I just thought it might be good to take a minute. Pier Paolo talked a little bit about tangible and intangible, and this is probably taking it to a little bit different perspective. But we, in cultural heritage, break in part some of it into tangible and some to intangible heritage as well. And just kind of being on the same page in terms of terminology, I thought was important. And just looking at, we have immovable heritage, getting into sacred sites, museums, libraries, bridges, the Capelbrook Bridge here in Switzerland that actually burned back in the 1990s due to a fire, one of the oldest bridges in the world, actually. The Cutty Sark, again, more cultural heritage, whether it's monuments, statues, and so forth. It comes in different shapes, sizes, and so forth. We also then get into movable heritage, art, statues, pottery, and so forth, that is still tangible, but obviously movable. From there, cultural heritage also gets into intangible heritage, which is more oral traditions, performing arts, rituals, things like that that are not so much a physical being, but more tradition at times. We also get into natural heritage when we talk about cultural heritage, as well as underwater. So without getting into a very detailed definition of cultural heritage, I'm sure there's many out there, just a little bit of background in terms of what we're talking about next. There's a need to start protecting cultural heritage and start addressing that in conferences like we're having here. And I wanted to just go through some of the different drivers of change which I think are driving where we're going. One is that we continue losing our heritage, obviously, through a number of different disasters, whether it's earthquakes, volcanoes, floods. They're impacting other types of buildings and people, but they're also obviously impacting our cultural heritage. Fires, tsunamis, and wildfires. And a lot of these, we're breaking this down into, of course, natural disasters, but we also get into man-made disasters. And as we've seen, particularly probably over the last year or so, some of the more World Heritage sites and structures of cultural significance are actually being targeted in terms of these man-made disasters. And we may be seeing more of this, hopefully not in the future, but you can see some of the damage that has been done to cultural heritage sites over the past years is somewhat increasing. So it's not just the actual disaster, it's during disaster and what's happening. Do we have disaster management plans in place? And as disasters are unfolding, are we able to protect our cultural heritage, or are we incurring further damage during the disaster? Or even following the disaster, do we have a disaster recovery plan in place? Or do we have such things as artwork or books that continue to increase the degradation, such as to mold, if we don't have proper disaster recovery plans? Or because we're not doing proper structural assessments, are buildings being torn down prematurely before they can be properly assessed, and especially if they're historic buildings, there may be opportunities. It may take a little bit more investment in order to protect those, but they still at times can be saved. And there's a lot going on, particularly in Christchurch, with regards to the cathedral there, that this is an important, an interesting aspect to be following at times. The second thing in terms of driver of change is we need to be protecting our cultural heritage. It really does play a significant role in society, both from a spiritual, cultural, social, economic perspective. It is very important in serving from a spiritual center to a physical anchor within a community or a region. It maintains a community sense of pride and just a gathering place. It also serves as an educational facility, which is obviously very, very important to a community. Economic, cultural tourism, a lot of times there's a significant amount of money coming into communities and regions, just people coming there to visit and look at the cultural heritage that can have a significant impact if that is not there, and who is coming to the community. And also in terms of times of emergencies, they oftentimes act as an area of refuge. The other thing is we need to be protecting our cultural heritage. These are one-of-a-kind structures. Once we lose them, we obviously can rebuild, but we don't have the same structure, we don't have the same artwork, we don't have the same statues and so forth once they're gone. Moving then into cost savings. There is a cost savings that we've seen. It's very difficult to quantify this. The World Bank has thrown out some numbers in terms of $1 invested in prevention saves from $4 to $7 in terms of costs that may be spent on recovery. Some work done in Peru looks at this ratio as basically $1 spent in terms of prevention, saving $37 on recovery. You can imagine this is more for normal buildings getting into cultural heritage, where costs are going to go way up on the recovery side, that these numbers are going to change significantly. But just to give you a relative idea, trying to put money more into the prevention side, there are significant savings on the recovery side. And this, again, is just shifting perspective. It's not looking at it so much as a cost savings, but more disaster mitigation and prevention, and more an investment in our future, in our community, and our culture, as opposed to a cost. An idea in terms of prevention, protecting, comparing two different earthquakes that have happened recently. The earthquake in Chile was an 8.8 on the Richter scale in 2010. Less than 1 person out of 600 were affected. That was due in large part to building codes that had been put into effect, and in terms of earthquake enhancements and reinforcement. Comparing this to the earthquake in Haiti, which was 500 times less powerful, but a significant amount of people, more than what was in Chile. So just in terms of putting prevention measures in place can be very, very significant in helping protect our heritage. Drivers of Change 5, just looking at alignment. There's a lot going on, and more the movement from the Hyogo framework to the Millennium Development Goals, as well as to UNISDR, and going from not waiting so much and investing in recovery, but more, let's try to head this off in terms of reducing risk and in terms of looking at more at prevention and mitigation measures that can be put in place. And one of the last things is also just looking at cultural tourism. And this is just very broad, kind of back of the envelope. But just taking the Cutty Sark fire, during restoration work, they apparently left a vacuum cleaner on over the weekend that ignited a fire. It had an impact basically of delaying the restoration work by 2 years. And if you just do a quick calculation, numbers of visitors a year times the ticket price came out to roughly $25 million a year, times 2 years is $50 million, plus an additional $10 million for the restoration that was a result of the damage is $60 million, and that's just due to the fire, and that's just with regards to the ship and people getting in and visitors, not looking at the local community, the restaurants, the souvenir shops, the hotels, and all the rest of that. So there's significant cost impacts from this happening that you can see, and just when doing a cost-benefit analysis, as Pier Paolo was talking about before, including some of these numbers too, that it's not just looking at your prevention and mitigation systems, but there's other factors that really should be brought into this. Great, so how do we move forward in terms of prevention over recovery? I think there's a number of factors that are important to this. One is creating awareness. There's a number of different people that we need to be talking to, from the government on down to the civil authorities, military, the banking institutions, the architects, the engineers, but also talking to them at different levels. They all have different needs, different interests, different drivers to help move them forward, to help protect cultural heritage in particular ways, whether it's more from a regulatory environment, whether it's more an investment perspective, whether it's a design perspective coming from the engineering and architectural community. There's different levels of engagement that we really need to be getting into. So that's the first couple of things that we can be doing in terms of trying to promote more of a culture of prevention over recovery. The other thing is engaging governments, as we are here doing this week, which is fantastic to see the governments, the ministries, the emergency response agencies and so forth, and just engaging them and drawing awareness to the need and the importance of cultural heritage, and including that in disaster management plans and the important role that they play in that. Implementation and demonstration through project work. Again, demonstrating something through previous projects and things that have been done in the past just hold a tremendous weight, and showing other people where things can be done and opportunities and their specific sites. But getting some of these success stories out there and what has been done is very, very powerful, and can help others learn from them and continue to move forward. And just being cognizant, I mean, not going into regions and trying to help them bringing our knowledge and technology, but really understanding what is happening locally, understanding the hazards, understanding materials, techniques, and the people, and using that in a lot of what they've learned in terms of developing long-term sustainable solutions, and not doing something and walking away, which may not be maintainable over the long term. So just being cognizant of what's happening locally and making sure that it is long-term sustainable. One of the important things too is just enhancing the role of media. I mean, we see everybody, everything is minute by minute on TV, the newspapers, everything is all very, very sensational about these disasters that are happening. And it's interesting, and everybody wants to know about that to a certain degree, but I think there's a whole other role that media needs to be playing in terms of both communicating the ideas, disaster risk reduction, telling stories, creating awareness, helping people actually, instead of just being all sensational about the news, but helping people, helping communities in terms of what needs to be done and how to move forward. The other thing though that's very important is just looking at root causes behind disasters and really digging into why hazards are turning into disasters. What is being done? Whose responsibility? How do we go forward with this, and trying to limit the next hazard becoming a disaster? Whether you can put blame or responsibility on anybody, but I think there's a lot that can be done, and I think it is a responsibility of the media to be cognizant of this and starting to get that information out there and make people more aware. And one of the things, this is a fantastic publication. If anybody has seen it, I don't know, it's probably been out for the last couple of years by UNISDR, but just great, very practical. It is not just for media people, but just help, in one way helping media people and driving them in terms of the importance of cultural heritage, but understanding disasters, but understanding terminology, understanding, looking at disasters, looking at risks, asking the pertinent questions, what it is that they should be getting out there to help people and lead us forward in doing better. I think there's a significant role in what media can be doing. One of the last things then is finding and engaging resources and technical experts. A lot of times, who do we turn to? And it's, do we just turn to a typical engineer or architect in trying to, move forward and protect our cultural heritage? In part, yes, but in part, no. I mean, there's a lot of specific nuances, so to speak, but we need to understand local culture, local methods and materials, being sustainable, obviously, limiting the impact to cultural heritage when we impose prevention and mitigation measures, and providing cost-effective solutions, obviously. So there's a lot of things that fall under that, and there are experts out there specifically looking at cultural heritage, and it is kind of a unique area to be getting into. One of the things, just to talk quickly, I am here as part of ICMOS, ICOR. ICMOS is the International Council on Monuments and Sites, and ICOR is the International Scientific Committee that specifically looks at disaster management with regards to cultural heritage. And there's a significant amount of things that we do, focusing on risk preparedness, promoting protection of cultural heritage, both natural as well as man-made armed conflicts and so forth. That we do get involved with. We do a lot of work in collaboration locally, internationally, and so forth with NGOs, with governments, and a lot of different entities, and trying to push this and promote this. It's also much broader. There's a lot of other people. There's a lot of synergies, basically, in terms of organizations that are out there. We have members from ICCROM. We have members from UNESCO, IUCN, some fairly significant organizations out there that are doing a lot of work with regards to cultural heritage. There's a lot of, again, synergy and overlaps in terms of helping to move this forward within the disaster management realm. One of the things that this group of entities has put together over the last couple of years is managing disaster risks and how we go about protecting World Heritage Sites, cultural heritage, historic properties. It's just a fantastic resource to have. And also recently is being released today is looking at another guideline, Heritage and Resilience, Issues and Opportunities for Reducing Disaster Risks. And I think it's, again, very important looking at disasters, incorporating cultural heritage. And we actually have a session, an hour-and-a-half session this afternoon from 11:15 with regards to specifically looking at heritage and the role that it plays in disaster risk management. So if you have time, It's in room 4. I apologize. Thank you. Today at 11:15. So if you can make it, that would be fantastic. We've got some great speakers from around the world talking about some very interesting topics. And with that, just to conclude, it's obviously important when we do disaster risk management plans to please look at cultural heritage and the role that it plays, and to make sure that that is part of it. And that we need to be looking at a more of a culture of prevention over recovery, not waiting till something happens to do something about it, but if we can, to do something beforehand. So with that, I thank you. Perfect timing. Thank you very, very much for being here this morning, and thank you for your attention. So, thank you.